The grand chamber of the Galactic Federation sparkled under the light of 3 artificial suns. Floating platforms carried representatives from over 200 species, each modified and evolved beyond their primitive origins. The chamber hummed with quiet conversation, all conducted through perfect universal translators that stripped away any hint of aggression from their words. Ray Miller shifted uncomfortably in his seat. As Earth's ambassador, he had grown used to the strange looks and quiet whispers that followed him through the Federation's halls. Humans were still new to the galactic community, and their unmodified biology made many species nervous. The Federation president, a tall being with silvery skin, raised all 4 hands for silence. "We gather today to celebrate 3 centuries of perfect peace," the president announced, voice carrying through the chamber. 300 years since the last act of violence within our borders. Ray noticed how the other representatives straightened with pride. Their genetic engineering had removed all aggressive impulses, creating a society where conflict was literally impossible. Even their bodies had changed. Many species had lost their natural defenses, from claws to tough skin, seeing them as remnants of a barbaric past. However, the president continued, their tone shifting slightly. "We have received disturbing reports from our outer colonies." The chamber's soft lighting dimmed as a hologram appeared in the center. It showed a distant mining outpost, now empty and damaged. "Something unknown has attacked 3 settlements in the past month." Gasps of shock rippled through the chamber. Many representatives physically recoiled from the images of destruction. Violence was so foreign to them that even seeing its aftermath caused distress. "This is impossible," called out one representative, their translator barely handling their agitation. No civilized species would resort to violence. Ray watched as panic slowly spread through the chamber. These beings had lived so long in perfect peace that they couldn't even process the concept of an attack. Their society had no soldiers, no weapons, not even basic defenses. They had evolved past the need for them, or so they thought. "Perhaps," suggested another representative, their skin changing colors with anxiety, "we can form a diplomatic mission. Surely any species can be reasoned with." Ray couldn't help but shake his head. Humanity had tried to warn the Federation about the dangers of complete disarmament. Earth maintained its defensive capabilities, earning them the whispered title of bloodthirsty among the Federation species. Now those same capabilities might be exactly what was needed. The debate continued, with suggestions ranging from surrendering the outer colonies to trying to communicate through art and music. Nobody suggested fighting back. They literally couldn't conceive of it. Finally, Ray stood up. His movement, more direct and purposeful than the flowing gestures of the modified species, drew immediate attention. "The Human Alliance offers its assistance in investigating these attacks," he said clearly. The chamber fell silent. The president's silver skin rippled with what might have been concern. "Ambassador Miller," they said carefully, "while we appreciate humanity's unique perspectives, we seek a peaceful solution." "Peace through strength," Ray replied, using an old Earth phrase that made several representatives flinch. "Sometimes, maintaining peace requires the ability to defend it." "You suggest violence?" asked a horrified voice from the crowd. "I suggest protection," Ray corrected firmly. "Earth maintains its military not because we love violence, but because we understand that not every species in the galaxy will share your enlightened views." The chamber erupted in whispers. Ray could see the conflict in their expressions, the horror at considering violence, warring with their growing fear of the unknown threat. The president raised their hands again for silence. "We will consider humanity's offer," they said reluctantly. "But surely there must be a more civilized solution." Ray sat back down, watching the debate resume. He knew that sooner or later, the Federation would have to face reality. The galaxy wasn't as peaceful as they wanted to believe, and sometimes you needed someone willing to fight to protect those who couldn't fight for themselves, even if they called you bloodthirsty for it. 3 weeks after the council meeting, Ray Miller stood in the Federation's Emergency Command Center, watching the horror unfold on the massive display screens. Another colony had gone dark, but this time they had received footage before communications failed. The images showed something that looked like a wave of living darkness flowing across the colony's streets. The Federation colonists, their bodies engineered for peace and cooperation, simply stood frozen as the wave approached. They couldn't run. Their modified brains wouldn't let them process the need for flight. Even their automated systems were useless, programmed never to cause harm. 16,000 colonists, reported a Federation analyst, their voice trembling. All gone, just like the others. The president's silver skin had dulled to a sickly gray. "We sent our best diplomatic team to make contact," they said quietly. The team transmitted messages of peace in every known format. And, Ray asked, already knowing the answer, the darkness consumed them too. The president's hand shook. "We received their final transmission. They were still trying to establish communication as they died." Ray walked closer to the screens, studying the footage. His unmodified human instincts screamed warnings at him. The darkness moved with purpose, with hunger. This wasn't just some mindless force of nature. This was a predator. "It's spreading faster now," another analyst reported. "The entity appears to be learning from each colony it consumes, growing smarter, stronger." A new alert flashed across the screens. Ray watched as more Federation representatives entered the command center, their faces showing confusion rather than appropriate fear. Their genetic modifications made it almost impossible for them to process the reality of the threat. "We've received a message," the first analyst announced. "It's different from anything in our records." The message played on the screens. It wasn't words or images, but a series of pulses and waves that made Ray's head hurt. The Federation's universal translators struggled to process it. Finally, a rough translation appeared. "Grow, consume, expand. At least we've established communication," one of the representatives said hopefully. "Now we can begin proper diplomatic." "That's not diplomacy," Ray interrupted, his voice hard. "That's a declaration of intent. This thing, whatever it is, doesn't want to talk. It wants to eat." The Federation representatives looked at him with a mixture of shock and disapproval. Violence was so foreign to them that they couldn't even recognize it when it threatened their existence. "Perhaps if we offer it alternative food sources," suggested another representative, "we could demonstrate the benefits of cooperative consumption." Ray fought back at a groan of frustration. "Computer," he called out, "display the entity's spread pattern." The main screen showed a map of Federation space. Red dots marked consumed colonies, spreading in a clear pattern. Ray pointed to the display. "It's not moving randomly. Look at the pattern. It's cutting off escape routes, isolating regions before consuming them. This isn't mindless. It's tactical." The president floated closer to the screen, their four hands clasped in distress. "But what can we do? We have no weapons, no defenses. Violence is literally impossible for us now." Ray took a deep breath. "Let me contact Earth. The Human Alliance has been preparing for something like this since we joined the Federation. We have ships, weapons, and people trained to use them." "Trained for violence," a representative whispered, horrified. "Trained to protect," Ray corrected firmly. "You engineered yourselves for perfect peace, and that's admirable. But someone needs to be able to fight for those who can't fight for themselves." The command center fell silent as another alert flashed across the screens. A fourth colony had just gone dark. The president looked at the expanding red dots, then at Ray. For the first time, real fear showed in their silver eyes. "Make your call, Ambassador Miller," they said quietly. "It seems we have no choice but to trust in humanity's protective instincts." Ray nodded and reached for his communicator. As he did, he noticed his hands were steady, his mind clear. Humans might be considered bloodthirsty by Federation standards, but right now, that might be exactly what the galaxy needed. The Human Alliance responded faster than anyone in the Federation expected. Within 24 hours of Ray's call, Admiral Tom Walker stood in the Federation's Grand Chamber, his crisp military uniform drawing confused stares from the assembled representatives. Unlike the flowing robes and ornamental dress of the Federation species, the Admiral's uniform was designed for function. The medals on his chest told stories of battles and conflicts that the Federation species couldn't even imagine. He stood straight and tall, his presence commanding attention without effort. "The First Fleet is ready to deploy," Admiral Walker announced, his voice carrying through the chamber without need for amplification. "We can have ships at the affected sectors within 3 days." The Federation president's silver skin rippled with anxiety. "And these ships, they carry weapons?" "Yes," Walker replied simply. "Each ship is equipped with our latest defensive and offensive capabilities. The fleet includes 25 capital ships and their support vessels." A horrified murmur ran through the chamber. The concept of building machines specifically for combat was deeply disturbing to the Federation species. Their own ships were beautiful works of art, designed for exploration and peaceful contact. Perhaps, one representative suggested, their translator struggling with their distress, your ships could try to contain the entity without actually causing harm. Walker pulled up a holographic display showing the tactical situation. Red markers indicated consumed colonies, while blue arrows showed the fleet's planned deployment. "With respect," he said, "containment isn't an option anymore. The entity is growing exponentially. Every colony it consumes makes it stronger and smarter." Ray watched from his position near the president's platform. He could see the internal struggle in the Federation representatives, their inability to process violence warring with their fear of extinction. "Could you demonstrate these weapons?" another representative asked hesitantly. "We need to understand what we're agreeing to." Walker nodded and adjusted the display. It showed footage from a human training exercise. Federation representatives gasped as energy beams and kinetic weapons flashed across space. Several had to look away. "This is barbaric," someone shouted. "Surely there must be another way." The Admiral's face remained calm, but Ray could see the tension in his shoulders. "The entity has consumed 7 colonies now," Walker said firmly. "Over 50,000 beings dead. It didn't try to communicate. It didn't offer peace. It consumed them while they stood there, physically unable to defend themselves." He looked around the chamber, meeting alien eyes without flinching. "You engineered away your capability for violence. That's your choice, and we respect it. But you also engineered away your ability to recognize threats and defend yourselves. That's not peace. That's helplessness." The president raised all 4 hands for silence as debate erupted. "Admiral Walker," they said carefully, "what exactly are you proposing?" "Let us fight for you," Walker said simply. "You can't do it yourselves. Not anymore. But we can. Not because we're bloodthirsty, but because we understand that sometimes you have to fight to protect what matters." Ray stepped forward. "The Federation prides itself on embracing diversity," he reminded them. "Different species, different cultures, different ways of thinking. Maybe it's time to accept that humanity's warrior instincts might have value too." The chamber fell silent as a new alert flashed across the displays. Another colony was under attack. The live feed showed the darkness flowing through streets, consuming everything in its path. The colonists, their faces peaceful even in death, didn't even try to run. The president watched the feed for long moments, their silver skin growing darker with each passing second. Finally, they turned to Admiral Walker. "Do what you must," they said quietly. "But please, try to remember that not all problems require violence." Walker's expression softened slightly. "We remember, Mr. President. That's what makes us different from the thing we're fighting. We don't want violence. We're just willing to use it when necessary to protect others." As the Admiral left to prepare his fleet, Ray noticed something interesting. The whispers of bloodthirsty had stopped. Instead, he heard a new word being repeated around the chamber. "Protectors." The bridge of the Human Alliance flagship Defender hummed with controlled energy as Admiral Walker studied the tactical display. Federation observers stood at the back of the bridge, their modified bodies trembling slightly at the sight of human military efficiency in action. "Contact in 5 minutes," announced Lieutenant Mary Reed from her weapons station. Her fingers moved steadily over the controls, prepping systems that hadn't been used outside of training exercises since humanity joined the Federation. The main screen showed the approaching darkness. It had grown since the first reports, now spanning several kilometers of space. The consumed mass of 8 Federation colonies had given it enormous size, and worse, intelligence. "Sir," called out the sensor officer, "the entity is reacting to our presence. It's changing shape." Walker nodded grimly. This was what he had expected. Previous Federation contact attempts had been met with simple consumption. But now, facing armed ships for the first time, the entity was showing tactical awareness. "Federation observers," Walker called out, his voice firm but not unkind. "What you're about to see may disturb you. You might want to leave the bridge." The observers, 2 tall beings with silvery skin like their president, straightened their backs. "We must observe," one said, though their voice shook. "We must understand." Walker respected their courage. For beings engineered to avoid all conflict, simply standing on a military vessel was an act of bravery. "Entity is accelerating," Reed reported. "It's forming. Tendrils. Attack pattern detected. Launch warning shots," Walker ordered. "Let's see if it can learn." Brilliant beams of energy lanced out from the defender's weapons, deliberately missing the entity, but demonstrating the ship's capabilities. The Federation observers flinched at each blast. The entity paused its advance. Its surface rippled, and new patterns emerged, shapes that looked disturbingly like the weapon emplacements on the human ships. "It's adapting," Walker muttered. "Just as we thought." "Lieutenant Reed, initiate attack pattern Delta. All ships, maintain formation." The human fleet moved with practiced precision. Ships took up positions in a complex 3-dimensional pattern, their movements coordinated by years of training. The Federation observers watched in stunned silence as what they had dismissed as primitive violence revealed itself to be an intricate dance of position and counterposition. The entity struck first, launching tendrils of darkness toward the fleet. But the human ships were ready. Point defense systems flared, cutting through the attacking limbs with surgical precision. "Analysis confirms it," the science officer reported. "The entities learned from consuming Federation technology. It's trying to incorporate our capabilities too." Walker allowed himself a small smile. "But it can't learn fast enough. It's never faced an opponent that could fight back." Execute Phase 2. The human fleet split into smaller groups, each executing complex maneuvers that kept the entity's attention divided. Federation observers gasped as ships deliberately flew close to the darkness, drawing its attacks while others moved into position. "Sir," Reed called out, "we've identified what appears to be a central mass. The entity's trying to protect it. All ships, converge on these coordinates," Walker ordered. "Remember your training. We're not here for revenge. We're here to protect." The Federation observers watched in amazement as the human fleet demonstrated the difference between violence and controlled military action. Ships coordinated their attacks with precision, cutting away at the entity's mass with carefully measured force. "Look," one observer whispered to the other. "They're not simply destroying. They're containing it, directing it." They were right. The human fleet was hurting the entity, driving it away from populated systems while steadily reducing its mass. Each shot was calculated, each movement planned. As the battle continued, the Federation observers began to understand something their species had forgotten. There was a difference between mindless violence and the disciplined application of force in defense of others. These humans weren't being bloodthirsty. They were being protectors. "Entity is retreating," Reed announced finally. "Confirmed kill on 30% of its mass. The rest is breaking up into smaller units." Walker nodded. "Maintain pursuit of the largest segments. Alert Federation colonies in the projected path. He turned to the observers. This is just the beginning. We'll need to establish proper defenses for the future. The observers, their fear now mixed with something like respect, nodded slowly. Perhaps their perfectly peaceful federation had room for warriors after all, especially warriors who fought not for glory, but to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The observation deck of the Defender had been converted into a makeshift conference room. Federation representatives from 12 species sat around a large table, watching recordings of the recent battles against the Dark Entity. Admiral Walker stood at the head of the table, explaining human military tactics with patience. "Notice how we contain rather than destroy when possible," he said, pointing to a holographic display showing human ships herding a segment of the entity away from populated areas. "Violence is our last resort, not our first instinct." One of the Federation observers, a being with crystalline skin, leaned forward. "But your ships, your crew, they seem to react so quickly to threats. How is this possible without genetic modification for aggression?" "Training," Walker replied. "Discipline. We don't let our aggressive instincts control us. We channel them, direct them, use them when needed and contain them when not." Ray Miller sat quietly at the back of the room, watching the Federation species struggle with their preconceptions. After 3 weeks of working with the human fleet, they were finally beginning to understand. "Watch this sequence," Walker continued, showing footage of a human ship positioning itself between the entity and a Federation colony. The captain knew the risk. The ship took damage protecting the colony. "That's not bloodthirst. That's sacrifice." The Federation representatives murmured among themselves. Their translators struggled with the concept of willing self-sacrifice, another trait they had engineered away centuries ago. "Yesterday," a tall, silver-skinned observer spoke up, "I watched your medical team treat a captured segment of the entity. Why help something that tried to kill us?" Walker smiled. "Because we can choose. Humanity's strength isn't in our capacity for violence. It's in our ability to choose when not to use it. We fight when we must, but we also heal when we can." The main screen showed new footage. Human scientists working to communicate with the contained entity segments. They had discovered that smaller portions could be reasoned with, lacking the overwhelming hunger of the larger mass. "Your species calls us bloodthirsty," Ray said, speaking up from his position. "But look at what that really means. We maintained our ability to fight not because we love violence, but because we understood that peace sometimes needs protecting." A young Federation scientist raised their hand. "I've been studying your training programs," they said hesitantly. "Your warriors spend more time learning when not to fight than how to fight." "Exactly," Walker nodded. "Any animal can lash out in violence. It takes intelligence, discipline, and compassion to know when to hold back. That's what makes a warrior different from a killer." The room fell silent as new tactical alerts appeared on the screens. Another entity segment had been detected, moving toward populated space. The Federation representatives watched as the human crew responded, their movements precise and coordinated. "Look at their faces," the crystalline being whispered to its neighbor. "They don't show bloodlust or joy. They show determination." Ray smiled slightly. The Federation was finally beginning to understand. Their perfect peace was beautiful, but it was fragile. Sometimes the galaxy needed people who could fight, not because they wanted to, but because they could do it while maintaining their humanity. "Admiral," one of the older Federation representatives spoke up, "our species modified ourselves because we believed that removing our capacity for violence would make us more advanced. But watching your people. You can choose peace without losing the ability to defend it," Walker finished quietly. "That's what humanity offers to the Federation. Not violence, but protection. Not bloodthirst, but controlled strength." As the meeting continued, Ray noticed something significant. The Federation representatives were no longer flinching when the humans moved suddenly. They were no longer whispering about barbarism and bloodthirst. Instead, they were asking questions about training, about discipline, about the balance between strength and restraint. They were beginning to understand that humanity's warrior nature wasn't a flaw to be engineered away, but a tool to be carefully controlled and used in defense of those who needed protection. The bloodthirsty humans were teaching the galaxy that true peace came not from the inability to fight, but from the wisdom to know when to fight and when to show mercy. The emergency alarm blared through the Federation's central space station. On the massive command screen, hundreds of red dots showed fragments of the dark entity converging on the Federation's core worlds. This was no random attack. It was a coordinated strike at the heart of civilization. Admiral Walker stood at the command center, Federation President at his side. The silver-skinned leader had insisted on staying, despite the danger. After weeks of working with humans, they had learned something about courage. "The entity has evolved beyond our predictions," Walker said, pointing to the tactical display. "The fragments are working together now. They've learned." Ray Miller watched from his diplomatic station as human ships moved into defensive positions around key Federation worlds. The past month had taught both sides valuable lessons. Human warriors protected Federation worlds, while Federation scientists helped understand and communicate with captured entity fragments. "All ships report ready," Lieutenant Reed's voice came through the comm. "The fleet is in position." The entity fragments approached like a storm of living darkness, each piece moving with terrible purpose. But they faced something different now. The human fleet was no longer just a military force. It was a shield, protecting billions of Federation citizens who couldn't protect themselves. "Look at their formation," the President observed, surprising Walker. "A month ago, they couldn't even look at tactical displays. The entity is trying to copy our fleet patterns." Walker nodded grimly. "It learns from what it consumes, but it can only copy the forms, not the understanding. That's our advantage." The first wave of darkness struck the human lines. Federation observers watched in stunned silence as the battle unfolded. Human ships moved with practiced precision, their formations shifting and adapting. Every move had purpose: protecting population centers, drawing threats away from civilian ships, containing rather than just destroying. "They're so controlled," one Federation scientist whispered. "Even in combat, there's no waste, no unnecessary violence." The battle spread across the star system. The entity had numbers and adaptive ability. The humans had strategy, discipline, and something the entity couldn't copy: the determination to protect others at any cost. Defender Squadron 6 moved to protect the civilian evacuation. Walker commanded. "Squadron 3, prepare containment fields." Ray watched the Admiral closely. This wasn't the mindless violence the Federation had once feared from humans. This was a dance of protection, every move calculated to save lives rather than just destroy the enemy. The entity launched a massive strike at the Federation capital. 3 human ships moved to intercept, taking heavy damage to protect the millions of citizens below. The Federation president's silver skin rippled with emotion as they watched humans risk their lives for people who had once called them bloodthirsty. "Entity fragments are converging," Reed reported. "They're forming a single mass, larger than anything we've seen before." Walker's eyes narrowed. "They think size will win. Show them why they're wrong. Execute Operation Guardian." The human fleet moved as one. Months of fighting the entity had taught them its weaknesses. Small ships darted in, drawing its attention, while larger vessels moved into precise positions. The Federation observers watched in awe as the complex battle plan unfolded. "Now," Walker commanded. Every human ship fired at once. Not randomly, but in a carefully coordinated pattern. The energy beams formed a net, cutting the entity into manageable sections. Containment fields sprang up, trapping each piece. The entity's mass writhed, trying to adapt, to learn, to overcome. But it couldn't copy what it didn't understand: the human ability to fight with precision and purpose, to use force not for destruction but for protection. Hours later, the battle was over. The entity's fragments were contained, its threat neutralized. The Federation's core worlds were safe. The President turned to Walker, their silver skin glowing with something like respect. "We once called your people bloodthirsty," they said softly. "We were wrong. You're not warriors because you love violence. You're warriors because you're willing to face it to protect others." Walker smiled slightly. "That's what we've been trying to tell you. Humanity doesn't maintain its military because we want to fight. We do it because someone needs to be ready to protect those who can't protect themselves." As cleanup operations began, Ray noticed that no one was using the word bloodthirsty anymore. Instead, he heard a new word spreading through the Federation Command Center: Guardians. 1 year after the final battle, the Federation's Grand Chamber looked very different. Along its curved walls hung new symbols, the shields of human military units next to the traditional peace symbols of the Federation. It was a change that would have been unthinkable just a year ago. Ray Miller stood at the speaker's podium, looking out at the gathered representatives. The Federation had changed. While most species maintained their genetic modifications for peace, they had learned to appreciate those who could still fight when needed. "The last of the entity fragments has been successfully contained," Ray announced. "Our scientists, working together with Federation researchers, have established communication with the smaller pieces. We're beginning to understand them." The President, their silver skin shining brightly, nodded in approval. "And what have we learned from them?" "They weren't evil," Ray explained, "just hungry and unable to understand other forms of life. In smaller fragments, they can learn, adapt, even cooperate. It was their massive combined form that lost the ability to see others as anything but food." Admiral Walker, now wearing a new uniform that combined human military styling with Federation ceremonial elements, stepped forward. "The contained fragments are being relocated to uninhabited systems, where they can exist without threatening others. Some have even started helping us understand deep space phenomena." A young Federation scientist raised their hand. "And what about the defense program?" This was the biggest change. After the entity crisis, the Federation had asked humanity to help create a volunteer defense force, not by modifying their genetics back to violence, but by teaching them human methods of controlled combat and protective tactics. The first class of Federation Defense Forces graduates next month, Walker answered proudly. "They've learned that you don't need to be engineered for violence to learn how to protect others. You just need dedication and training." The chamber buzzed with conversation. A year ago, the very idea of Federation species learning combat would have been shocking. Now, it was seen as a natural evolution of their society. "We were wrong about humans," the President announced, rising from their platform. "We called them bloodthirsty because they maintained the ability to fight. We didn't understand that there's a difference between having the capacity for violence and being violent." Ray smiled as he remembered the past year's changes. Federation ships now carried small human defense teams. Federation scientists worked alongside human military researchers, combining their peaceful technology with protective capabilities. It wasn't a step backward from their enlightened state. It was an acceptance that true peace meant being able to defend it. "Humanity didn't join the Federation to teach us about war," the President continued. "They joined to teach us about protection, about the courage to face violence without becoming violent, about maintaining the ability to fight while choosing peace." Walker stood straighter as the President approached him. They carried something in their forehands, a new symbol, combining the Federation's peace sign with the shield of the human defense fleet. "From this day forward," the President declared, "the Federation recognizes the human alliance not as primitive warriors, but as our guardians, not as bloodthirsty soldiers, but as protectors who choose to bear the burden of defense so others may live in peace." The chamber erupted in applause. Federation representatives, who once flinched at the sight of uniforms, now stood to honor the humans who had protected them. Ray watched as human and Federation species mingled freely, no longer separated by fear or misunderstanding. The Federation hadn't abandoned its peaceful nature. It had simply learned that true peace sometimes needed guardians. "You know," Walker said quietly to Ray, "a year ago, They called us bloodthirsty. Now they understand that being willing to fight isn't the same as loving to fight. Ray nodded, looking out at the changed Federation. That's the real victory, he replied. Not defeating the entity, but showing the galaxy that true strength isn't in avoiding violence or embracing it. It's in having the wisdom to know when to fight, when to protect, and when to show mercy. As the celebration continued, the word bloodthirsty was nowhere to be heard. Instead, the halls of the Federation echoed with a new title for their human allies: Guardians of Peace.